Ed D'Agostino here, speaking with George Friedman from Geopolitical Futures. George, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Let's chat about Europe. The EU seems to be falling apart as a union. You have Brexit. What's going on there?
Well, first of all, it has fallen apart in this sense. On the migrant issue, Brussels is making rules and regulations, and no one's paying attention. Those that want to pay attention do, those who don't. So the idea that it's a given that the various nations will do what Brussels says is past. Had Brexit not occurred, it was very clear the British were going to do what they wanted to do, one way or the other. So we have passed, I think, in my mind, a critical point where the European Union is functioning as it was intended. The essential problem is economic. In 2008, we had a crisis. This is 2016, 8 years later. They still haven't solved it. Southern Europe is still in depression. Unemployment rates well over 20%. Eastern Europe is facing the Russians without any real support for the rest of the country. And the periphery like Britain saying,
We're out of here.
So you can't maintain an economic union that for 8 years can't cope with some sort of coherent policy that'll end the crisis. And the reason it can't cope with it is there is no common understanding of who owes what to whom. So the idea that you're a state in the American Union, New York, you got banking problems. Congress says we're all going to chip in. Texas, you got to chip in. Texas says, no, I don't want to. Not an option. In Europe, it is an option. And nobody wants to come up with the resources to solve the problem.
And yet, Greece has been extended lifeline after lifeline. Italy will probably be bailed out. I mean, at what point do you reach the limit of a single currency union with so many different geopolitical structures in place?
We've reached that limit. Greece would not have the crisis it has if it had the drachma and could have revalued it. If it could have taken the drachma, dropped it in value. If its bonds were denominated in drachma, if all these things had happened, we wouldn't be in this mess. The euro is the problem, not the solution. So it takes a really difficult situation where you've basically said, because nobody would agree, you're a sovereign nation. You can do what you want, but you're a member of the European Union, which is kind of a mind-boggling and difficult thing to figure out how it works. And you've compounded it with a single currency that no one has a national bank that can deal with. So where are we now? We're in a situation where there has been a catastrophic depression, as bad as the US in the 1930s, throughout most of Southern Europe. It's been 8 years and no solution. So, yes, there have been bailouts. And it's kind of the stupidest thing you can do in business. Put in enough money that the system doesn't fail, but not enough that it succeeds. And how many businessmen do we know who have tried to do that? And that's what the Europeans have done.
So you take a region that economically, politically is really under stress, and then on their shores you dump tens of thousands of immigrants. Mm-hmm. Seems like a recipe for disaster. How does the immigration problem impact all of this?
It impacts it in an odd way, because the real problem is not the immigration. It is Europe's inability to develop a coherent plan and institute it. What is the problem with the economy? No one can agree on what the European strategy on the economy should be. What is the problem with migrants? Exactly the same thing. Nobody can agree on what the strategy should be. The problem is sort of like if the United States, after the Civil War, had a bunch of states formally secede. Everybody kept working together. And we tried getting New Hampshire and South Carolina to have the same policy. It can't work. We settled the problem at Gettysburg. Nobody's going to die for Europe. And therefore, any stress at all is going to pull it apart. And certainly the problem of Islamic terrorism compounds it. Certainly the problem of having migrants compounds it. But that's not the problem. The problem is that there is no consensus in how the EU should be run.
So give me your forecast. You're a forecaster. Give me your forecast for Europe, say in 10 years from now. What does it look like?
The European Union may continue to exist. No one will pay attention to it. In Europe, institutions never die. They just become irrelevant. What is happening already, what is the reality is that every nation is doing what it has to do for itself. They may try to negotiate within the EU, but they're negotiating for themselves. So when President Hollande used to meet Chancellor Merkel, it'd be two European leaders. Now it's the President of France talking to the Chancellor of Germany, and they're not talking about what is the common solution. They're talking about what's in their interest. And the smaller nations and the larger nations are having this, and the mainstream parties who believe deeply in the EU are losing power to surprising new parties that are coming up and basically saying, look, our interest is in our country. EU is not helping that. We're not going to stay in that. And that's where Brexit came from. Being surprised that the majority of the country didn't feel they were benefit from it. And the response in Europe was, what stupid people, they're uneducated, that's really a great way to deal with a loss. But it gives you a sense of the huge split in Europe between the elites that are Europeanist and the middle and lower middle class that's under huge pressure, financially and otherwise. Their values being rejected and so on. So if you are a lower middle class person and you're afraid of Muslims, you're a racist. The upper classes, who will never live with the Muslims, not the migrants, they won't see them. They won't be in their neighborhoods. They are very generous with the others. It's coming apart.
Is it inevitable that as the elite and the elite's parties lose power in Europe, that you have a big shift to a more nationalist and a more right-leaning type of political system?
Well, two things are happening. Firstly, the centrist parties are shifting to the right. But
just to stay in power?
Just to try to flank out the right-wing parties that have become so strong. In France, you'll see President Sarkozy, if he's elected president again, winning because he's moved right to take the National Front's, the right-wing party there, the National Front's territory. So whichever way you look at it, if you want to call it right, you're seeing the resurrection of the European nation state. But remember, the EU was partly created to avoid war, to get rid of the cause of war, the national states. Now we're seeing them rise again. In other words, we're back at what Europe was.
Does that mean war on the continent again, or are we beyond that finally?
Well, 100,000 people died in the Balkans after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Everybody sort of said, well, that's not really Europe. It's really Europe. And 100,000 people died in it. And there is, when you go to Europe, anger at the Germans, a feeling the Germans have engineered this for their own benefit, German contempt for Southern Europe. It is amazing how much hostility between various nations there is. Does it go to war? I don't know. But it certainly isn't going to peace.
George Friedman, thanks for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.